the idea of defence at all, the idea of defending these islands for me is not a way towards any kind of global security. I think there has to be a different way of defining how we look after ourselves. That is not about that defending borders. I think security has to be about the security of the people within a community and not the security of the borders around it. Thinking about the white paper, I have to say as well that I suppose I always find it difficult because I come at all of this very much now from a Scottish perspective, which is partly because I think we have opportunities to make real and lasting change for everybody globally from a Scottish perspective. I say that, and yet my commitment is to do my best to be a global citizen. So my coming at it from a Scottish perspective is not a patriotic Scottish perspective. My identity with Scotland is cultural and from a political point of view opportunistic. So we had a meeting with the Justice Ministers, some of us, which was mostly initiated through a project that was done jointly between Trident Ploughshares and the Peace and Justice Centre and INLAP. And the idea was to try and get after the first SNP victory, to try and get the Scottish Government to reconsider the Lord Advocate's reference on the case of the Trident 3. And one of the people that came to that meeting was Jerry Hughes, who's a Jesuit priest. And we're all sitting there, and Kenny McCaskill's rustling his papers and talking politics and looking to his civil servant to make sure he's not saying anything that he shouldn't be saying. And in the middle of it, Jerry Hughes just has this beaten up briefcase, and he pulls this sheaf of papers out of it and puts it on the table in front of him, and it's a very thoroughly examined, dog-eared and grubby looking copy of the white paper. And so people kind of stopped talking and were a bit focused on what he was doing with this copy of the white paper, and he proceeded to say what a really admirable document it was in terms of its technical covering of every single aspect of what would be involved in a replacement for Trident. And then he kind of took a pause and he said, the thing I don't really understand is why it doesn't say anything about killing people. And I wonder if Hitler had had to produce a white paper on the gas ovens that were used in Germany, if it would have mentioned killing people. And you could have heard a pin drop, because it just completely altered the whole discussion. And I suppose that's partly why I found what Thomas was saying about bringing the whole picture of what nuclear weapons are about is really important. I think somehow we always have to do that. It's not about the technicalities, it's not about the legal perspectives, it's actually about the fact that these things kill people and destroy the planet. I'd just like to read a little bit of what Judge Weeramantry said at the conference that we held in Scotland about Scotland's obligations under international humanitarian law. and he started off by saying, when Genghis Khan was engaged on his blood-drenched career of world conquest, he is said to have proclaimed a policy that any cities which defied him would be razed to the ground, with not a hut standing and not a whimper of life remaining. Not even a dog or a mouse would survive, let alone the humans who would be exterminated with no exceptions. The powerful nations in the early 20th century like to describe themselves in international documents as civilized nations. Yet the successors of these nations are prepared in the 21st century to manufacture, stockpile, undertake research on weapons which can, in fact, outdo such primitive brutality. They claim the right to use a weapon that can exterminate all life in the target city down to the last microbe. Despots like Genghis Khan would have dearly loved to have enjoyed that power. And that is always, I feel, what we're talking about. So the Strategic Defence Review, which is one of the justifications for the replacement of Trident, actually has identified cyber threat as now a number one risk. These weapons couldn't possibly defend us against cyber threat. I think what I said earlier about the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, you can keep leafing back and going backwards, but the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom were amongst peace groups that attempted to stop the First World War. But they were very clear at the end of the Second World War that the seeds had already been, at the end of the First World War, that the seeds, the Versailles Treaty actually, you don't need to say what would you do about Hitler, because if the Versailles Treaty hadn't inflicted such draconian measures, then a figure like Hitler never would have been able to arise or gain power in the first place. I think that the whole question about jobs and the arms trade investment is also something that we just need to completely open up our real understanding of what that means. Creating jobs or getting a shipbuilding contract has absolutely nothing to do with nuclear weapons. I remember Rosie Kane in the Scottish Parliament at one point saying that when they gave up having firing squads, all the guys would have lost jobs, but it's not a good justification for keeping firing squads is to keep people in work. And it's a complete, there is actually no logical through line between saying we want to create jobs in shipbuilding or anything else for that matter, and saying we need to replace Trident. It just, there was one set of statistics that somebody came up with where they said that if they actually laid off everybody that was currently working on the nuclear programme at Faslane and gave them 45k a year to do absolutely nothing, we'd still be spending less money than we're spending employing them to do what they're doing. So the relationship between sexual violence and militarism is now abundantly clear. And one of the things about, again, from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the research that's been done it's very clear that the majority of victims of bloody conflict throughout the planet are women and children, civilians, and amongst the civilians, women and children. And so these weapons are quite, they're going to, even if they're not used, the security forces that are necessary to maintain them, the kind of secrecy, the kind of planning that goes around those weapons being maintained and controlled, require a very centralized, secretive command system, and that has that's the inevitable consequence of that. I just wanted to say a bit about Global Zero as well, because there have been a number of suggestions that nuclear disarmament at a global level is desirable. Global Zero is not one that I personally have a great deal of time for, because I actually don't believe them. Obama is the top level group. I think that when you have people that are not actually doing the business when they're in a position of power, and then they retire, like Schultz and Kissinger are saying, after they're out of that position, that they wish we should all get rid of nuclear weapons. They didn't do it when they were in a position to actually do something about it. They're saying it now, but if you actually look more closely at what they're saying, the Global Zero campaign, which includes Des Brown, who was the defence minister at the time that the white paper for the replacement of Trident went through, and Margaret Beckett, who was a member of the government when that went through, and who both support the white paper. And they have some kind of tautological philosophy that says global nuclear disarmament is a good thing, and the replacement and modernisation of Trident is part of the process of getting there. So, I mean, I don't find that remotely trustworthy as a suggestion. And if you actually look at the process that is recommended by Global Zero, the process is exactly the same process that is failing within the NPT, because it's a process of reduction of numbers of warheads. It's not the ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which is suggesting that we should have a nuclear weapons convention to outlaw them in the same way as landmines or cluster bombs have been outlawed. That process is suggesting that you start by taking all of them off alert, and then you remove the warheads from the missiles, and so that again it's still incremental, but it's actually having an immediate effect that makes a thermonuclear explosion less likely. The Global Zero process just reduces the amount of weaponry you need to have without actually reducing the capability of having a thermonuclear explosion. And it doesn't reduce the likelihood of an accidental thermonuclear explosion either. So I think that's a really important, it's a really important distinction to make. I'm also, this whole thing about the Cold War is over, and that somehow or another we're saying that the Cold War made it mad an okay policy, and I don't actually agree with that. I think that the Cold War was the inevitable consequence of that policy. I think that that policy exacerbated and prolonged its own process. I don't think that I don't think there is anything that actually it's the argument about the elephants that keep away
whatever it is that's the bad insects in your garden, and there's no bad insects in the garden, so it must be working. I mean, that's the only argument there is for that. There's no. I think that in terms of dialogue, negotiation, conciliation, arbitration, international humanitarian law, we're not actually trying any of these things. And I think that the recent intervention in Libya is a particularly fine example of how completely you can screw it up, because it's looking at a situation where the only problem that you've got is that people are in conflict with each other, and the only tool that you've got is a hammer. And so when the only tool you've got is a hammer, then the problem looks like a nail. And if you have some other means of dealing with the situation, then there is a possibility that it could be a different sort of problem from the one that you first thought it was. So what we said, or the United Nations said that in 1973 that it was necessary to have a humanitarian intervention in Libya. And what did they do? They sent troops in. To me, that's not a humanitarian intervention. Where were the conflict resolution trained people? Where were the negotiators? Where were the people from outside of that region that were prepared to arbitrate? None of those things were tried, and we don't put any resources into doing that. And really, I think that the nuclear weapons at the core of it means that at the core of the value system that we use for working out how to deal with all sorts of problems and all sorts of ways of managing the workings of what goes on at every level, from bottom to top and back down again, is all on the basis of secrecy. It's all on the basis of control, and it's all on the basis of centralization. Because these are the things that you need if you're going to use nuclear weapons. And I think that the damage that nuclear weapons do is much, much greater than the damage that a nuclear weapon, and that's still a pretty horrific notion, than the damage that is caused by its detonation. The damage that is caused is the damage that's caused spiritually, the damage that is caused to our imagination. It's the damage that's caused by the lack of resources for the things that we actually really do need. I mean, I thought some of what was being said about science, I mean, the resourcing that went into the Manhattan Project was insane. But that is also, it's also about the science chasing its own tail and a meritocracy of what's actually good science. And a lack of mindfulness, a lack of actually taking time out to look at what you're doing and what that really means. It's one of the things that I find very relevant to this is if you think about the word myth, and when we say myths, when you start talking about myths in modern society, what people mean is basically things that are just stories that have been put about that aren't really true. That's what they mean. That's what people mean when they talk about myths. And yet the myths the classical myths, or where our wisdom about ourselves and the world and the planet comes from. And we're not actually listening to those stories or those lessons. I just wanted to also say just a bit about the ICJ ruling and our understanding of it, because even an anti-nuclear weapons person like Thomas described it as being a fudge. And I actually take exception to that, because it wasn't a fudge. It's actually to do with how it's been interpreted, and how it's been interpreted by a very small number of completely undemocratically supported individuals. And there is a huge democratic deficit as far as nuclear weapons is concerned. There's a democratic deficit in that it was all decided behind closed doors in secret, so that even within governments, even within cabinets, it wasn't democratic. And there is, for me, a kind of an additional democratic deficit as a Scottish person, in that the elected representatives in Scotland have not supported it. And as far as the replacement of Trident is concerned, they've never had support from the Scottish elected representatives. And there is also a deficit insofar as none of these decisions have been made by women. None of these decisions about nuclear weapons have been made by women. They've been made by men. Despite the fact that the first victims in war are women and their children. So what the ICJ ruling actually says after it has several A, B, C, D, E and F paragraphs, there is in neither customary nor in conventional international law any authorization of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, etc. And eventually the fudge is in the paragraph. However, in view of the current state of international law and of the elements of fact at its disposal, the court cannot conclude definitively whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of the state would be, the very survival of a state would be at stake. Which is not saying modernizing Trident is therefore legal, and it's nowhere near saying that. So there are other equally dodgy references that are widely understood and put about this situation. One of the things is the Non-Proliferation Treaty does not, in the way that it was worded, and it was certainly not the intention of the Irish government in their drawing it up, to suggest that there was some kind of a payoff in terms of people getting to have nuclear power. What it said was that it didn't specifically exclude the development of nuclear power, which is a different thing from saying you're entitled to have nuclear power. You can't have nuclear weapons, but if you're a non-nuclear weapon state, you can have nuclear power. That's not what it says. As far as China as a threat, there are certain things that China has done that are very rarely acknowledged by the UK government and are not widely known in this country, like the fact that China is committed to a nuclear weapons convention. It's signed up to the nuclear weapons convention, and it has a stated policy that it will never use nuclear weapons in a first strike situation, which the US doesn't have and the UK doesn't have. The UK and the US will not outlaw the use of nuclear weapons as a first strike, as having a legitimate first strike policy. And in fact, it's part of NATO. It's that they will use them as a first strike weapon. So to suggest in some way that China is a belligerent country that needs to be watched is just ridiculous, really. I think those were the main things. I think there was something else there that I did want to. Yes, I mean, I don't want to open another huge subject, but I don't think we can think about or talk about nuclear weapons development without an awareness of the use of drones and unarmed, and the commandeering of space for the purposes of nuclear warfare at a distance, at no risk to the perpetrators, because that is ultimately where this leads you. That's where the whole thing leads you, unless we actually get rid of these weapons. And I think Scotland is in quite a powerful position in terms of doing that. So that was the riots, the non-violent direct action. That's about me, I think.
Wow. Thank you. Any questions for Jared?
I just would like to hear from other people.
Observations. Do you want to tell us a bit more about your involvement with the anti-nuclear weapons thing? You said you started in the 60s.
Yes, then I went away and lived in
Holy
Ireland.
Loch in Scotland.
Uh-huh.
What was the base in
Well, I was
Holy
just a
Loch
wee
in the
member of
60s?
CND that
Yeah.
went along.
And what was there? There was a big base in there.
That was Cruise when Polaris. Yeah, that was Polaris at that stage.
Yeah, it was
right.
Yeah.
The American Navy were based
Yeah.
at Holy Loch with submarines.
Just near Dunoon, basically.
Yeah.
Sandbanks.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And they actually had like submarine facilities there, or was it ships as well?
There were. It was the Polaris missiles, and they brought them up, and so they were based. Those submarines were based at the Holy Loch, and the other place that there was anti-nuclear activity in Scotland at that time was around Versailles. But I mean, it was the Americans who were running the base, and
right. So they're American submarines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a US Navy run base like Lakenheath or.
Okay, so we were just the carriers for
Yeah.
American nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
do you know anything about the American involvement in the current Faslane base? Are they there, or is it solely a British-run thing?
they're not there, but the weapon is entirely dependent on their technology.
The actual Trident
Yeah.
ballistic missiles are American.
And
Exactly.
the so-called special relationship means that it's not independent either in terms of getting what you need to have it there, or in terms of its use without the American government being aware that you're doing that.
So they
it's
would
not
be giving
independent.
authorization. Yeah.
I don't think. I mean, it's hard to see how Britain could use a nuclear weapon independently of the Americans. You know, it's not as they'd be giving authorization, but the whole system, they're American-built missiles. They're to change one or replace one. The Vanguard class submarines have to go to the United States to change them over. All they do here is swap over the warheads. And then to target them, you're relying on American technology, American satellites. So the whole system is completely dependent
From Washington.
on Washington.
Really?
It really isn't independent at all.
And the submarines have actually got to go to a dockyard in America?
The missiles,
Yeah.
to change the Trident missiles, which are American built.
Right.
And the new ones, there's some concern that they're not going to fit, so they'll need to get the American new ones.
Right.
I mean, it's just nonsensical to suggest that it's independent.
Because one of the arguments used for Trident is it gives us an independent deterrence, independent of America, isn't it? Whereas Norway, say, which is under the American NATO nuclear umbrella, doesn't have its own. They say that we don't need them, we're under America's umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Britain's argument was, well, we want our own independent one, you know, because the French have got it. But actually it's not
that's purely it's an
Yeah.
argument about macho status.
Yeah, Britain
It's
and America.
it's not about actual independence or being able to use it secretly without America's
No.
involvement.
Right, well that's news for some people, I'm sure. Yeah.
It possibly was back in the days of the Vulcan bombers and things like that. You know,
Bit more independence then.
yeah, but not now. Also, I mean, isn't Coolport entirely run by an American company?
Yes,
Is it?
Mm.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
company?
It's I don't know.
I can't remember.
When you say run by, you mean like the security people or the whole infrastructure?
Yeah. You know, it's,
That's the storage place of the bombs,
Yeah.
just down the road. You
Yeah,
can see it from the
yeah.
castle. So it's run by an American company.
yes.
Lockheed
So this is
Martin.
kinetic. They're not.
Lockheed Martin.
Is it Lockheed Martin running it?
I think never found out in a local paper that it was listed.
Someone. We'll have to check.
I know we got somebody got it wrong the last time that was put out. There's Lockheed Martin and Serco and
Yeah.
What's the one that was up the road?
It might be
Called-
kinetic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's got some American finance behind it, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
probably.
I believe.
Yeah.
Mm.
Probably.
So the economics of all this is interesting, the research into who owns these companies and who promotes them and lobbies for them.
Well, it's all tied into arms trading.
Yeah.
Right. So that's another thing. I mean, have you in Scotland thought through the... Because one of the arguments going on between Whitehall and Edinburgh at the moment is about tax and corporate taxation and finance and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be bad for Scotland's economy to leave the UK and all that. I wonder how much of Scotland's industry is involved with defence, do you know?
Not as much as they would like you to believe. And it's also, I mean, it would seem that from the STUC and CND did a joint study on the jobs, and it's not been kind of fully done insofar as it's still looking at a militarised model, but taking the nuclear bit out of it. That's where that figure of, I mean, I'm hopeless at remembering statistics, but I did remember that one because it just seemed so completely outrageous about the 45k a year for everybody that's working on the submarines. But the job losses that have been ascribed to Faslane being closed down, depending on who you listen to. If you listen to Jackie Bailey, who's the local MSP, it was supposed to be 11,000. Now
11,000 jobs. Yeah.
And the STUC and CND did this joint study on it, and it was a fraction of that. I can't remember the number now, but I mean it was less than 2,000 jobs. You know.
Right. Actual direct jobs.
So that figure is massaged and manipulated in a very unhelpful way, and yet despite the fact that we've actually now got the figures, Jackie Bailey's still going around saying there's 11,000 jobs at risk, you know. And it doesn't actually, if Scotland...
What party does he represent?
She,
sorry.
Labour.
Labour. Scottish Labour.
I mean, having said that, they're politically have the Scottish Labour Party politically have their backs completely against the wall on the subject of nuclear weapons in Scotland, because the last time that there was any kind of vote in the Scottish Parliament on the subject was in June 2006, and they've done everything they can to prevent there from being another debate on that issue in the Scottish Parliament, because the last time the Scottish Labour Party failed to get a single Scottish Labour MSP to vote against the motion, which was the motion was to say, we want you to reconsider the white paper. We don't think you should go ahead with the replacement of Trident at this time. And they couldn't actually get a single Scottish Labour MSP to vote with the government's, at that time, Labour government's policy on the subject. So they looked really stupid when that happened. And that was one of the factors that led to the SNP gaining a greatly enlarged majority at the last election. And the Scottish MPs, I mean, I was noticing you mentioned that early day motion, and although we haven't got a majority of MPs signed up to that early day motion, we've got no homework to do in Scotland on it, because they've done it, you know. So one of the Scotland's for Peace aims, when it came into existence after devolution happened, was to get the majority of Scottish elected representatives to speak out against nuclear weapons in Scotland, to speak out against Trident. And they've achieved that. They achieved that at quite an early stage, and that is a position that's been maintained in every election since. So that's what I mean about the democratic deficit in Scotland. Scotland doesn't want nuclear weapons. All the UK's nuclear weapons are in Scotland, and Scotland doesn't want them. The churches, the trade unions, the STUC, all the major churches, the Muslim Council of Britain, plus various of the usual suspects in terms of sort of peace organisations, have all spoken out publicly against Trident. And yet we've got the weapons here. And because there is a separate and independent legal system in Scotland, there is a question as to whether or not Scotland's obligations under international humanitarian law should force them to try and do something about it. Now, at the moment, the Scottish Government are unwilling to try and do something about it because they think that they'll get their knuckles rapped and they'll be acting outside their devolved competence, and they'll be sent to bed without any supper or something terrible. In actual fact, it is a view of quite a large number of people with considerable expertise that under the Nuremberg principle, the Scottish Government is under an obligation to tell the UK Government to get stuffed. So,
is the new Ministry of Justice in Whitehall, does that have responsibility over legal matters in Scotland or just in England and Wales?
No, but what can happen is, thing that we could very usefully do as a campaigning objective would be to get as many that question about the Trident system in particular, then it would fail to meet the criteria as far as being indiscriminate and not damaging civilians and not damaging... because that little clause would only relate if you could actually somehow or another invent a nuclear weapon that complied with international law. If you could have a tiny little nuclear weapon that could be safely targeted and only wipe out Osama bin Laden and not anybody else, and that wasn't going to damage the environment because it had its own lead box that it exploded in or something. I don't know, you know. But if you could invent such a nuclear weapon, then it might not be illegal. So the different question is, would Trident be legal under international law, either the present system or the proposed replacement? Now, the American government have said that if a particular system that they are using was referred for an ICJ ruling, they would do their neither confirm nor deny policy, and they wouldn't be bound by that, and they wouldn't participate in giving information because it would threaten national security. However, the UK government has said that in the event of a question about their particular system being referred to the ICJ, that they would abide by its ruling.
Which government said that?
The UK government.
Well, the current Cameron government or Blair government?
I think probably the Blair government, but I mean, but it is now binding on them.
Right. Can I ask you another question about? Firstly, can you just tell us what the book is you've been quoting from? Just hold it up and tell us.
I will give you. I've got a copy in the car to give you.
Trident and International Law by.
It's by a number of people. I've got a chapter in it.
But
mine's just not the most important chapter by any means, but it's got, this was a conference that coming out of this work that I was saying that when I was at the Peace and Justice Centre and the Acronym Institute, which is a woman called Rebecca Johnson,
right,
and Angie Zelter, who's the founder of Trident Ploughshares, and we organised this conference, and we got all these high-powered international lawyers to come to Edinburgh and have a conference about a seminar about international law and Scotland's obligations. And then we kind of tried to get senior legal figures and MSPs and people to come to it, which was the really hard part.
When was it? When did it take place?
2009.
Right. So the
book came out a year. The book came out a year later,
right.
And the book is basically the papers from the conference. So it's got a chapter by Judge Christopher Weir-Mantry. It's got a chapter by Judge Bijui. It's got a chapter by Philippe Sands and Helen Law, and Ravinder Singh and Nick Grief and Aidan O'Neill.
That's fascinating.
So I've got a copy for you, which I brought with me, but it's in the car. This is actually...
Yeah. We have a whole collection on international law and peace, so it can fit in that.
But this is absolutely up to the minute.
Okay. No, it's very, very interesting.
And it's specifically about Scotland.
I've got another question for you, final question. About it's kind of law, but to do with economics and contracts, because one of the problems about upgrading Trident and buying that now is to do with the way these contracts are negotiated and done. My understanding, my reading of the literature is that the government of the day will sign a binding contract with the military procurement industries of billions and billions, which then becomes a binding contract on all future governments. So let's say the current UK government actually bought into the upgrade for Trident and stuck £10 billion, on the table and said there's more to come. They would be able to do that in a way that the contract is then eternally binding on all future UK governments and presumably Scottish governments. And that worries me. If, what happens and what can people do about that?
I don't know is the answer.
Is anyone thinking that through? I mean,
I don't know,
you know,
but I do know that...
Watch that space, because I think
Yeah.
we're about to do that.
Well,
in the
I
next
think
year or two.
I don't know the answer, but there are observations that I would make are that the delay on they have an initial gate and a main gate to the decision.
Right.
And delays on those can be useful in that context. Having said that, it's also, I mean, it was all sewn up yonks ago. Long before the white paper was published, there were deals between the UK and the US government on the table. We've seen the correspondence between them. We were just talking earlier when we were on the break about the fact that there's planning permissions going through on a monthly basis at Aldermaston, which is all infrastructure in preparation for this, although it's not gone through these gates, you know. So
it's as if the decision is taken earlier,
Yeah,
and then it's
yeah.
sort of stamped. A bit like some people say the decision could go to war
But-
in Iraq was taken
So,
earlier.
yeah, absolutely. But I don't actually think that the democratic process per se can actually, if you had the political will to make the change, it would always be possible. Even in terms of those kind of contracts,
Right.
you know.
You can change the law and pass a new law that
Yeah.
says you can get out of it.
Yeah,
If the
they
political
could
will
do
is
that if the will was there to do it. The other thing I would say, which I think is enormously important and very, and it's one of the things that's definitely an issue in terms of our work with the Scottish Government at this point in time, but you see it all over the place, is that you can talk to the politician, but then somebody has got to talk to a civil servant, and that's when it goes completely pear-shaped. Because the civil servants and the diplomats are being lobbied right, left and centre by people, as you described, and the whole thing with Liam Fox and all of that is I mean, it doesn't come as any great surprise to me. It didn't come as any great surprise to me that was happening with Liam Fox, you know, because it's just kind of what you actually expect, and that is to do with the interests of corporations and big business, and that's in a way why the whole thing is so dreadfully interlocked, because, and that's what I mean when I say it's not just about nuclear weapons, it's about the mentality that allows nuclear weapons to be developed,
And
which is
corporatism is part of that.
very much so, very much so. So, I mean, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom campaign for this year, our campaigning slogan for this year, is to challenge militarism and invest in peace.
Right.
And to invest in every sense. Part of it is to do with the financial resources that are not there or that are wasted and squandered on these things. But it's also about a meritocracy that allows the development of boys' toys and cleveralities in the way of scientific analysis, and that doesn't actually give any meritocracy to stopping and considering the beauty of a fern
Or life.
or life in a respectful way.